Well, three new species, two frogs and a gecko, have been discovered on Australia's northernmost island in the Torres Strait. The island is just 3 square kilometres, but its remoteness and rugged terrain means it's been little explored by science. Species from New Guinea and Australia have been marooned on the island, evolving in isolation over time. Conrad Hoskin, conservation biologist and associate professor in biodiversity at James Cook University, joins me now. Conrad, good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Hello, Catherine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great, thank you. Just how unusual is it to be making these sorts of new discoveries?
It's unusual in Australia to be finding distinct species new to science, particularly for vertebrates. So that's mammals, reptiles, birds, frogs. Yes, and particularly it's unusual to be finding new species new to science, like several of them in one place. So it is exciting.
Okay, so you've found a new frog and gecko species. What are they?
So the gecko is the Dwan Island gecko. It's an elongate gecko with lovely black and you can see the picture there. It scampers around on the rocks, highly evolved to the big boulder fields. The interesting thing about Dwan Island is the mountain that centers the island is just millions of huge boulders, and the creatures there to live in these boulder fields have had to adapt. And then the two frogs are very interesting. One is maybe a golf ball sized frog that lives down in the boulder fields. It's got a really lovely croaking call. And then the one you can see on screen now is only about the size of your fingernail. It's a tiny little frog. It's got a really, really high pitched, super loud call, and it calls in all the vegetation that just festoons the boulders. So there's vines and creeper, all sorts of things over the rocks, and that little frog's living up in them.
And is that how this frog was discovered, through the sound that it makes?
Yeah, so frogs, the best way to identify frogs really is through their calls. And it's probably the quickest way when you're an expert on frogs to realise that you're probably onto species that are new to science. So we heard these frogs calling and we were like, wow, we don't recognise those calls at all. Turns out their closest relatives are up in New Guinea, so they're actually quite distant from their relatives. Two groups that we didn't otherwise have in Australia. I mean, they were always there, but now they're discovered to science. So yeah, really cool.
Yeah. So you mentioned the uniqueness of Dwan Island there with its rocky crevices. Can you tell us a little bit more about that island and why it is, brimming with activity?
Yeah. So the Torres Strait is really interesting because it sits obviously between North Queensland and New Guinea. So it's got a bit of a mix of the wildlife of both. But the Dwan Island is actually quite different from the surrounding islands and also the adjacent New Guinea mainland. Those islands in the mainland of New Guinea there are really quite flat. Whereas Dwan Island, when you approach it, it's a great big triangle coming out of the sea. And interestingly, it's the furthest northern peak of the Great Dividing Range. So that range all the way up the east coast of Australia reaches its northernmost point as Dwan Island. So that's basically a mountaintop sticking out of the sea. And it's just absolutely piled up with these huge boulders and rainforest growing around the boulders. And there's a little flat fringe where the community lives, but most of the island is this huge boulder field. And the species that are there, they need rainforest. So they, like their relatives, are up in the highlands of New Guinea, but here they found refuge in the cool, moist conditions of the boulder field. So it's really allowed them to survive and persist in an environment around that's otherwise not very good for such creatures.
And you mentioned there, Conrad, that a community lives on the island.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for thousands of years, obviously, living on the islands to the Torres Strait, including on Dwan Island. So they've been managing the land for, so many generations, and that will continue. There's the Dwan Land and Sea Rangers who will continue surveys for these species. And there's no doubt other undescribed species on the island too, which will be good to be discovered in future to science anyway.
And that was going to be my last and final question, Conrad. How many undiscovered species do you think there might be?
There could be a lot. When you're finding vertebrates, which are the more conspicuous animals, the ones we know better, like frogs and reptiles, there's a very high chance that there's a whole lot of less conspicuous or less well-studied creatures like invertebrates, so spiders and various invertebrate groups that will remain to be discovered to science on the island. So, and that's not just on Dwan, that's probably elsewhere in the Torres Strait, elsewhere in Australia. I mean, we're still discovering the most incredible biodiversity, even in Australia. It's amazing.